You ever sit down at your PC expecting everything to just work, but instead you get this weird low-level frustration you can't even fully explain? Not a crash, not a freeze, just that feeling that your powerful hardware still isn't behaving the way it should. And that feeling is exactly what pushed companies like Valve to start questioning how PC gaming even works for normal people. Because at some point, PC gaming stopped feeling simple and started feeling like something only enthusiasts could really manage properly. And Valve saw that gap between simplicity and power as an opportunity. So they tried something ambitious, something that would eventually be called the Steam Machine. The idea was simple on paper. Take the openness of a PC and package it like a console. Something that boots quickly, sits in your living room, and just lets you play games without thinking about drivers or settings. On paper, it sounded like the perfect middle ground between console simplicity and PC freedom. But that middle ground is exactly where things started to get complicated. Because Steam machines weren't just one device. They were an entire ecosystem of different hardware, different specs, different prices, different performance levels, all under the same name. And that immediately created confusion for consumers. Because when people buy a console, they expect consistency, not variation. And that's where the first real crack in the Steam Machine idea appeared. Then came SteamOS, the operating system designed specifically for this idea, a Linux-based system that would boot directly into Steam without Windows getting in the way. The goal was to remove complexity entirely. But the problem was that the ecosystem underneath wasn't ready yet. Linux gaming support at the time was still extremely limited. Many games simply didn't run properly or required workarounds. And for most users, that immediately broke the promise of simplicity, because no one wants to troubleshoot their console before playing a game. Then came another issue. Pricing. Steam machines weren't cheap enough to feel like consoles, but also not flexible enough to feel like full gaming PCs. And that left them in a very uncomfortable position. Consumers looked at it and asked a simple question: why not just build a PC instead? And once that question appears, the product is already in trouble. And this is where the Steam machine stopped being exciting and started becoming confusing for almost everyone who looked at it. Because instead of one clear product, Valve had created an entire ecosystem of machines that all behaved slightly differently. And in consumer tech, variation is not always a good thing. People don't want to analyze hardware charts before buying something they just want to use. That alone already created friction before anyone even turned the device on. But the real problem started when SteamOS entered the picture. At the time, Linux gaming wasn't what it is today. It was limited, inconsistent, and often unpredictable. Some games worked perfectly. Others barely launched, and many didn't run at all. And that inconsistency destroyed the console-like simplicity Valve was aiming for. Because a console that sometimes works is no longer a console. Then came pricing. And this is where things got even more complicated. Some models were priced close to full gaming PCs, but without the clarity or flexibility of building your own system. Others were cheaper, but then performance dropped significantly. So consumers ended up stuck in the worst possible situation: not cheap enough to be a console, not powerful enough to be a full PC. And once that identity problem sets in, adoption slows down immediately. Because people don't buy confusing middle ground devices. They buy things they instantly understand, and Steam machines failed that test almost immediately. Momentum started fading faster than Valve expected. At this point, Valve didn't abandon the idea. They started analyzing it deeply. Because in tech, failure is often just data in disguise. And the data told a very clear story. Too many hardware variations were destroying consistency. Linux gaming support wasn't mature enough yet, and developers simply weren't prioritizing SteamOS. That combination made success almost impossible at that time. But instead of giving up, Valve shifted strategy quietly. They stopped focusing on many devices and started focusing on one. And that single idea eventually evolved into something much more successful. Because the Steam machine wasn't really the end of the idea. It was just the first rough prototype of something much bigger. Valve realized the core problem wasn't the concept of PC gaming in a console form. It was fragmentation. Too many hardware configurations meant no stable target for developers. And without a stable target, software consistency collapses. So Valve made a major strategic shift. Instead of many devices, they focused on one unified system, a controlled hardware environment, designed from the ground up. This idea eventually became the Steam Deck. And unlike Steam machines, this time Valve controlled everything. Hardware, software, performance targets, all aligned into one experience. But the biggest difference wasn't just hardware. It was time. Linux gaming had quietly matured in the background, and Proton changed everything. Games that once failed on Steam machines now ran surprisingly well. Suddenly, The biggest Steam Machine weakness was no longer a problem. The ecosystem finally caught up to Valve's original vision, but it took years for that to happen. Years of iteration, failure, and quiet development. And most people never saw that evolution happening behind the scenes. They only saw the failure, not the learning process. Today, the Steam Deck represents everything Steam machines tried to be, but properly executed. A unified device with a controlled experience. One hardware target for developers to optimize for. And that small change solved a massive industry problem. Because consistency is everything in game development. Without consistency, even powerful hardware becomes unpredictable. And Steam machines failed exactly on that principle. Not because the idea was bad, but because the timing was wrong. And now, looking back, it becomes clear what Valve actually built. Not a failure, but the foundation of modern portable PC gaming. And this is where most people misunderstand the Steam Machine story completely. They think it was just a failed product. But it was actually an early experiment. An experiment that tried to solve a problem the industry hadn't matured enough to fix yet. Because in tech, being first doesn't always mean being successful. Sometimes it just means you arrived before everything else was ready. Steam machines were exactly that kind of moment, and Valve learned something critical from it. Control matters more than openness when building consumer hardware. Consistency matters more than flexibility for mainstream adoption, and timing matters more than ambition. When the Steam Deck launched, it proved those lessons were finally applied correctly. One device, one experience. One target for developers, and suddenly Linux gaming didn't feel like a compromise anymore. It felt intentional, stable, and finally usable at scale. What Steam machines couldn't achieve in 2015, Steam Deck achieved years later. Not because the idea changed, but because the ecosystem did. That's the part people usually miss. Hardware alone never fixes ecosystem problems. Software maturity is what unlocks hardware potential. And Steam machines were simply too early for that unlock. But without early experiments like that, we never get breakthroughs later. Every failure in tech leaves behind a blueprint for something better. Steam machines were that blueprint, and the Steam Deck is the proof that the idea was never the problem. Sometimes in tech, the biggest failures are just future successes arriving too early.